and the grief I carry is something I will live with for the rest of my life. My children were my everything and kept me going every day. They were my joy, my hope, that the moment we had an opportunity to finally have a family fun day, my kids would never come back home with me. She took everything in my life and destroyed it.
Once your mom picked them up, 30 to maybe 40 minutes, probably maybe an hour at tops, I was getting calls from my phone constantly from people I haven't met in years, family members. I felt in my stomach something was very wrong. I knew that there was something that wasn't right. There was people from over 20 years that I haven't talked to, 10 years, my family. My brother finally got a hold of me and told me there was an accident at the boat club regarding my kids. I felt it in my stomach that something was wrong. I didn't know that there. He wouldn't tell me. No one would tell me what was wrong. People kept writing me, get to this boat club, get to this boat club. It was chaos. I was seeing cars everywhere. I'd seen people everywhere. I finally went to my brother. When he told me that he couldn't tell me to go to the cops, a chapel guy came on my corner and I dropped straight to the ground. I started screaming because I knew they was gone. I felt they was gone. I knew in my heart they was gone. So I told him not to tell me. I begged them not to tell me. But they had to find out I was the dad of all three of them, and I told them their names, their ages, and what was I to them. Before I even registered it was gone, they told me that Jaden, my oldest, was airlifted to the University of Michigan. I didn't even have time to grieve. I didn't have time to process what was going on with Alanah and Zayn because I had to rush to U of M. I had to make sure Jaden was okay.
April 20th, 2024. Children's laughter filled the Swan Boat Club in Newport, Michigan, as 8-year-old Alanah and 4-year-old Zayn Phillips celebrated at a birthday party. Then, at 3 p.m., a vehicle tore through the building's wall at 44 miles per hour, traveling 25 feet inside before stopping. The driver, 67-year-old Marshella Chidester, blood alcohol content 0.18, more than double the legal limit. And this wasn't just any boat club. Her father helped found it. She'd held her wedding reception there. She'd been its commodore. In this video, I'll walk you through who Marshella Chidester really was, the morning she spent drinking wine before getting behind the wheel, what surveillance cameras captured inside her home, and how a grandmother became a convicted murderer sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison. But here's what investigators discovered that changed everything. So, who exactly was Marshella Chidester? Before the 20th of April 2024 turned her into a household name for all the wrong reasons. Born in November 1957, Marshella Marie Chidester was 67 years old at the time of her sentencing. She'd lived in her home on Brancho Road in Newport, Michigan since 1985, nearly 40 years in the same house. By all accounts, she had no criminal history, not even a speeding ticket. Her attorney would later describe her as someone who drives like a little old lady. This was a woman who, on paper at least, seemed like the model citizen. Now, Marshella wasn't just any resident of Monroe County. She had deep, personal roots at the Swan Boat Club, a place that sits along Swan Creek, a canal off Lake Erie, right in the shadow of the Fermi 2 nuclear plant. Her father had helped found the club decades earlier, making it a cornerstone of her family's legacy. She'd held her own wedding reception there. Think about that for a second. The place where she celebrated one of the happiest days of her life would decades later become the scene of unspeakable tragedy by her own hand. In 2017, Chidester served as Commodore of the Swan Boat Club, the top official responsible for setting the club's agenda and direction for the year. This wasn't some honorary title handed out casually. Being Commodore meant she was trusted, respected, someone the community looked to for leadership. She lived just yards down a gravel road from the club, close enough that she could probably see it from her windows. The boat club wasn't just part of her community, it was part of her daily life, woven into the very fabric of her identity. But Marshella's life extended beyond the boat club. She worked at the nearby Fermi 2 nuclear plant as a strategic buyer for DTE Energy, a management position she held before retiring 9 years earlier. This wasn't some menial job. She was in procurement, making strategic decisions for one of Michigan's major energy companies. Her LinkedIn profile reflected a professional woman with a solid career behind her. When the tragedy occurred, DTE Energy released a statement saying they were devastated by the tragedy and noted that many members of our DTE family live in the community and have children who are schoolmates of those who lost their lives. Chidester was married to a man named Don. During the chaos immediately after the crash, as witnesses tried to help the injured, she was asking where her husband was. Public records show possible relatives including Brandy Lynn Carl, Donald Eugene Chidester, Kelly Elisa Chidester, and others, a family network that would later watch as their mother, wife, and relative faced murder charges. Here's where the picture starts to complicate though. According to a defense attorney, Bill Kolovos, Chidester had been experiencing epileptic-type seizures in her legs since November 2023, issues that caused sporadic paralysis. Kolovos claimed she was taking medication for these seizures and had been treated for them the day of the crash. He would later argue this was a factor in the accident. Yet prosecutors pointed out there was no evidence Chidester had been under doctor's orders not to drive. Anyway, by all outward appearances, Marshella Chidester was living a quiet retirement in a place she'd called home for decades. She had a family, a history of community service, no criminal record, and a professional background that suggested stability and responsibility. She was a grandmother, someone who should have been spending her golden years at family gatherings, maybe even at the very boat club where she'd once served as leader. But appearances, as we know, can be deceiving, because there was another side to Marshella Chidester that wouldn't fully emerge until after the 20th of April 2024. During her arraignment, the Monroe County prosecutor Jeffrey Yorkey cited an alleged severe substance abuse issue when arguing for a $1.5 million bond. According to court testimony, a boat club member had outlined a history of alcohol use when speaking with law enforcement. This wasn't the first time people close to her had noticed drinking, yet her defense maintained she'd never had even a traffic ticket and emphasized her clean record. Neighbors knew her as someone who lived quietly on Brancho Road. The community likely saw her as Miss Chidester, the former commodore, someone who'd spent decades as part of the fabric of Newport. The contrast is jarring, isn't it? On one hand, you have this respected community member with deep family ties to the boat club. On the other hand, you have allegations of substance abuse serious enough for prosecutors to demand a $1.5 million bond. So which was the real Marshella Chidester? Well, the truth, as it often does, lay somewhere in the complexity. She could be both the woman who served as commodore and the woman struggling with alcohol. She could be both the grandmother with no criminal history and someone whose drinking habits were noticed by those around her. People aren't simple. They're layered, contradictory, capable of being multiple things at once. What we know for certain is this. On the 20th of April 2024, six-year-old Marshella Chidester, grandmother, retiree, former boat club commodore, and longtime Newport resident, would make a decision that would destroy multiple families, including her own. She would drive her vehicle into the very place her father had helped build during a children's birthday party, while her blood alcohol level was more than twice the legal limit. The woman who once set the agenda for the Swan Boat Club would instead set in motion a tragedy that Monroe County would never forget. And here's the thing that makes this so haunting. Surveillance footage would later show that on the morning of the crash, while the Phillips children were still alive and getting ready for their birthday party, Chidester was walking around her home drinking wine. Their father, Brian Phillips, would later say, "It was haunting to see my kids were still alive at that point. That if she would have just stopped, my kids would still be alive." That's who Marshella Chidester was, a woman with every opportunity to make a different choice, living just 200 yards from where children were about to celebrate a birthday. A woman whose next decision would end 2 young lives and shatter countless others. The 20th of April 2024 started like any other Saturday morning in Newport, Michigan. But for Marshella Chidester, the day began at 9 a.m. when she walked into a party store and purchased 4 small bottles of white wine and a standard bottle of red Cabernet. Anthony Cathawa, the party store employee who served her, would later testify about this transaction in court. It was a seemingly ordinary purchase, except this wine would be in her system just hours later when she crashed through the walls of the Swan Boat Club. Now, what Chidester did between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. would become some of the most crucial and haunting evidence in her trial. Prosecutors played 6 home surveillance videos from inside Chidester's own house, footage that captured her movements throughout the morning and early afternoon. The videos started at approximately 9:30 a.m., showing Chidester walking back and forth from a sitting area to her kitchen. In 4 of those videos, she appeared to be holding a small, clear plastic bottle in her hand, bottles similar to the mini wine bottles Cathawa had sold her that morning. But it gets even more specific. In the 5th video, she walks into view holding a wine glass filled with red liquid, the same red Cabernet wine the party store employee testified he'd sold her. In the 6th surveillance video, Chidester walks to the sink carrying an empty wine glass, then moves back toward the seating area, with the glass refilled with more red liquid. These weren't just a few sips with breakfast. This was sustained drinking throughout the morning while children were getting ready for a birthday party just 550 feet away. Around 11 a.m., Chidester left her home and went to Verner's Tavern with 2 friends. Kelly Thornton, who worked part-time at the bar, testified that she served Chidester a cup of white chicken, chili, and 1 glass of wine. The defense would later claim this was the only alcohol Chidester consumed that day, 1 glass at lunch that she didn't even finish. But those home surveillance videos told a very different story. Anyway, by early afternoon, Chidester was back home. Surveillance footage from her own property would capture what happened next, and it's chilling. The video shows her carefully walking down her stairs, moving slowly and unsteadily, then deliberately walking toward her car. This was at approximately 3:01 p.m., a time when families at the Swan Boat Club were in full celebration mode, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Chidester got into her vehicle and backed out of her driveway, but she didn't make it far. The surveillance video captured her crashing into her neighbor's truck with enough force to push it backward approximately 20 feet through a working fence. She also struck a small pine tree that stood in front of the truck. Think about that for a second. She'd already had 2 collisions before she even left her property. According to the vehicle's event data recorder, at the point of impact with her neighbor's truck, she was already traveling at 13.8 miles per hour. Now here's where it gets truly disturbing. After hitting her neighbor's truck and the tree, Chidester didn't stop. She didn't get out to assess the damage. She didn't turn around and go back inside. Instead, she put her car in drive and sped off. Her home was approximately 550 feet from the Swan Boat Club, less than 2 football fields away. It would take her less than a minute to reach the building, where dozens of people, including young children, were celebrating a birthday party. Meanwhile, at the Swan Boat Club, families had gathered to celebrate Kristen Sigler's son's birthday. Among the attendees were Mariah Dodds and her 3 children, her eldest son Jaden, 8-year-old Alanah Phillips, and 4-year-old Zayn Phillips. Also, there was Diane Medina, a member of the boat club, along with numerous other families and children. The atmosphere was joyful laughter, birthday cake, kids running around doing what kids do at parties. Nobody had any reason to be afraid. Kristen Sigler, the mother hosting the party, had stepped outside to FaceTime a friend, a decision that would likely save her life. Inside, the party continued without interruption. Then, at approximately 3 p.m., everything changed in an instant. Chidester's vehicle accelerated from 29.4 miles per hour to 44.3 miles per hour in the 5 seconds before impact. According to the event data recorder analysis, the accelerator pedal was at 96% at the moment of impact, meaning her foot was essentially pressed all the way to the floor. The braking system was not engaged. Zero braking. Her vehicle crashed through the wall of the Swan Boat Club, traveling approximately 25 feet inside the building. Witnesses would later testify they thought a bomb had gone off. The sound was that explosive, that unexpected, that violent. Diane Medina testified that she heard a loud explosion, saw dust and debris everywhere, and remembered being pushed before everything went silent. She said tables were on top of her. Her pelvis was broken in 6 places. She had internal bleeding, a concussion, a crushed nose, and a fractured bone in her lower leg. One witness, Jason Wickland, heard a baby cry, and looked underneath the vehicle. He yelled for a jack. Someone was trapped under Chidester's SUV. Kristen Sigler, who had been outside on FaceTime, heard someone yelling that a baby was trapped under the vehicle. The chaos was absolute. Cell phone video and police body camera footage would later capture the screams, the dust, the confusion, the horror. Deputy Stephen Schmidt arrived at the scene within minutes. He testified that he could smell the odor of intoxicants on Chidester, that she had bloodshot, watery eyes. Denise Roberts, one of the victims who had been hit and lost consciousness during the crash, testified that when she came to Chidester, was being placed in a chair next to her. Roberts said Chidester kept saying, "What happened?" and I passed out. Then one of Roberts' nephews yelled at Chidester, "Shut the fuck up, you lying bitch, you're drunk." Several witnesses at the scene testified they could smell alcohol on Chidester's breath. This wasn't subtle. Multiple people, in the midst of chaos and tragedy, noticed the smell of alcohol. Deputy Cody Carrena interviewed Chidester at the scene, with his body camera capturing the exchange. He read her Miranda rights. She's heard saying, "I'm hoping no one was hurt." She told Carrena she was taking gabapentin and other medications. In bodycam footage, she admitted to drinking a little bit and claimed she had a history of seizures and that she may have passed out. Deputy Schmidt testified that he didn't perform a breathalyzer test on Chidester because, given the serious injuries at the scene, he wanted to make sure they did a blood draw for more accurate results. He gave her a sobriety test, but had to help her walk. She couldn't complete the test. He arrested her and placed her in the patrol vehicle. Chidester was then taken to Monroe Hospital, where phlebotomist Roe Mundy performed a blood draw following the exact instructions in the Michigan State Police blood kit. Mundy testified that she made sure the powdered preservative was properly mixed into the vial of blood by inverting it back and forth. The blood sample would be crucial evidence. But while Chidester was being processed at the hospital back at the Swan Boat Club, the horrifying reality was becoming clear. Alanah Phillips, age 8, and her brother Zayn Phillips, age 4, were dead. A total of 15 people were injured, 9 of whom needed to be hospitalized with serious or life-threatening injuries. Mariah Dodds, the mother of Alanah and Zayn, testified that when she woke up in the hospital the day after the crash, her sister was crying next to her bed. Dodds asked why they were there. That's when her sister told her that their eldest son Jaden had been life-flighted to another hospital and that Zayn and Alanah were no longer there. Imagine waking up from unconsciousness and learning your 2 youngest children are dead. Edward Smothers, just 14 years old, testified about going to the birthday party with his aunt, Mariah Dodds, and his cousins. He said he heard the crash and somewhat remembered it happening. He couldn't walk and didn't try to stand because it hurt too much. The results from Chidester's blood draw came back quickly. Her blood alcohol content was 0.18, more than twice the legal limit of 0.08 inches. Michigan. This wasn't borderline intoxication. This was severe impairment. Wait, what? Let's pause there for a second. During the prosecutor's rebuttal case, Monroe County Sheriff's Deputy Alec Predmore testified that when the tow truck driver removed Chidester's car from the boat club, he found a small bottle of Chardonnay in the center console. Even in her car, there was wine. The pattern of drinking that day was undeniable. So here's what we know for certain about the 20th of April 2024. Marshella Chidester bought multiple bottles of wine at 9 a.m. Surveillance footage shows her drinking throughout the morning in her own home. She went to Verna's Tavern around 11 a.m. and had at least one more glass of wine. By 1 p.m., she was backing out of her driveway unsteadily, crashing into her neighbor's truck and a tree. Then she accelerated to 44 miles per hour on a dusty, pitted dirt road with her foot 96% on the gas pedal and crashed 25 feet into the Swan Boat Club. 2 children died. 15 people were injured. And here's perhaps the most damning detail from prosecutors. This is not a typical drunk driving crash. She drove her car into an occupied building knowing she was unfit to operate a vehicle. The fact that she'd already hit her neighbor's truck and a tree before even leaving her property meant she had clear evidence she shouldn't be driving, but she kept going anyway. The day that started with wine purchases at 9 a.m. ended with 2 dead children, a devastated community, and a grandmother in handcuffs facing murder charges. The 20th of April 2024 would be a day that Monroe County, Michigan would never forget, and a day that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. So once deputies arrived at the Swan Boat Club that afternoon, they immediately knew alcohol was a factor. But what investigators would uncover over the coming hours and days would paint an even more damning picture than anyone initially realized. Sergeant Michael Beaumier was the first deputy on scene. He testified later that the moment he approached Marshella Chidester, he could smell alcohol coming from her. Not faint traces, the smell was obvious. She had trouble maintaining her balance. When he tried to conduct a field sobriety test, she recited the alphabet correctly, but she couldn't focus her eyes on his finger and struggled to count backward from 100. Then came the question every officer asks in situations like this. Deputy Stephen Schmidt, who arrived shortly after, asked Chidester directly, "Should you have been driving?" Her answer was chilling in its honesty. "I wouldn't want to drive," she told him. When asked to rate how drunk she felt on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being passed out drunk, Chidester answered 7. 7. Think about that for a second. She knew she was severely impaired, yet she'd gotten behind the wheel anyway. Now, Chidester did tell deputies she'd been drinking wine about 30 minutes before the crash, and that she was on medication for seizures. When Schmidt asked what she remembered, she said, "I pulled into the parking lot as if she'd simply parked normally." She told them she didn't remember what happened. According to her, everything just went black. But investigators weren't buying the seizure story, especially once they started examining the physical evidence. Deputy Cody Carrena interviewed Chidester at the scene with his body camera rolling. The footage captured everything: her slurred speech, her unsteady movements, her admission that she'd been drinking a little bit. Multiple witnesses at the scene would later testify they smelled alcohol on her breath. This wasn't subtle. In the chaos of a tragedy where people were screaming, where tables were overturned and dust was everywhere, the smell of alcohol on Marshella Chidester was still noticeable enough that person after person mentioned it. Schmidt made a crucial decision that day. He didn't rely on a preliminary breath test at the scene because those tests can be inaccurate and aren't admissible in court. Instead, he wanted a blood draw more accurate, more reliable, and legally solid evidence. He arrested Chidester and placed her in his patrol vehicle, then took her to Monroe Hospital. At the hospital, phlebotomist Roe Mundy performed the blood draw following the exact procedures outlined in the Michigan State Police blood kit. She made sure the powdered preservative was properly mixed into the vial by inverting it back and forth, following protocol to the letter. The blood sample was then sent to the Michigan State Police Forensic Lab for analysis. When the results came back, they confirmed what everyone at the scene already suspected. Chidester's blood alcohol content was 0.18, more than double Michigan's legal limit of 0.8. To put that in perspective, at 0.17, Michigan defined someone as super drunk. Chidester was past that threshold. This wasn't someone who'd had one glass of wine with lunch and got unlucky. This was severe intoxication. But prosecutors weren't done building their case. They brought in Lieutenant Brian Quinn from the Monroe County Sheriff's Office Traffic Services Unit. Quinn specialized in analyzing event data recorders, essentially a vehicle's black box that records everything happening in the moments before and during a crash. And what that black box revealed was absolutely devastating. According to Quinn's testimony, the EDR in Chidester's Ford Edge recorded 2 crashes that day. The first was when she hit her neighbor's truck. At that point of impact, her vehicle was traveling 13.8 miles per hour. That collision triggered the EDR to start recording. Then came the second crash, the one at the Swan Boat Club. Here's where the technical data becomes crucial. In the 5 seconds before Chidester's vehicle slammed into the building, her speed went from 29.4 miles per hour to 44.3 miles per hour. She was accelerating rapidly. And according to the EDR data, at the moment of impact, the accelerator pedal was at 96%. Quinn explained what that meant in plain terms. The pedals to the floor. Her foot was essentially pressed all the way down on the gas. And the brakes? The braking system was not engaged. Zero braking. Not even an attempt to slow down. Wait. What? Let that sink in for a moment. Chidester, had already crashed into her neighbor's truck and a tree before even leaving her property. She knew something was wrong. She had to have felt that impact. But instead of stopping, she floored the accelerator and drove 550 feet down a dirt road at increasing speeds with her foot jammed on the gas pedal until she crashed 25 feet into a building full of people. The defense would later try to argue this was evidence of a seizure, that maybe her feet had flattened involuntarily, pressing both the brake and accelerator at the same time. And technically, the EDR data did show a half-second period where both pedals were pressed simultaneously. Quinn testified that instances of both the gas and brakes being pressed at the same time were rare. But when the defense asked if he knew of situations where this was caused by a medical emergency, Quinn said he wasn't qualified to answer that question. Anyway, what the EDR couldn't explain away was the pattern of behavior before the crash, because while the defense was arguing seizures and medical conditions, prosecutors were gathering evidence of sustained drinking throughout the day. Remember that party store employee, Anthony Kathawa? He testified that at 9 a.m. that morning, he'd sold Chidester 4 small bottles of white wine and a standard bottle of red Cabernet. That's 5 bottles of wine purchased before most people have finished their morning coffee. Then came perhaps the most damning evidence of all the surveillance footage from inside Chidester's own home. Prosecutors played 6 videos for the jury, footage captured by Chidester's home security system. The videos started at approximately 9:30 a.m. and continued throughout the morning and early afternoon. In 4 of those videos, Chidester appeared to be holding small, clear plastic bottles in her hand, bottles that looked remarkably similar to the mini wine bottles Kathawa had sold her that morning. In the 5th video, she walks into view holding a wine glass filled with red liquid, the same red Cabernet the party store employee testified he'd sold her. In the 6th video, she walks to the sink carrying an empty wine glass, then moves back toward the seating area with the glass refilled with more red liquid. These weren't surveillance cameras catching her off guard. This was her own home security system documenting hour after hour of drinking. While children just 550 feet away were getting ready for a birthday party, Marshella Chidester was walking around her house drinking wine. Zayn Phillips, the father of Alanah and Zayn, would later say something haunting about those videos. "It was haunting to see my kids were still alive at that point, that if she would have just stopped, my kids would still be alive." Every minute captured in that footage was another minute she could have made a different choice. Every glass of wine was another decision that moved her closer to tragedy. Around 11 a.m., Chidester left her home and went to Verna's Tavern with 2 friends. Kelly Thornton, who worked part-time at the bar, testified that she served Chidester a cup of white chicken chili and 1 glass of wine. Thornton said Chidester appeared sober when she arrived. The defense would cling to this testimony, arguing that 1 glass of wine at lunch was all Chidester had consumed that day, but those home surveillance videos told a completely different story. Well, if that wasn't enough, prosecutors had one more piece of evidence to present. During their rebuttal case, Monroe County Sheriff's Deputy Alec Predmore testified about what happened when the tow truck driver removed Chidester's vehicle from the Swan Boat Club. Hidden in the center console of her car, investigators found a small bottle of Chardonnay, one of those mini bottles. Even in her vehicle, ready to go, there was more alcohol. Now, Chidester's defense attorney, Bill Kolovos, fought hard to discredit the blood alcohol results. He brought in forensic toxicologist Okorie Okorocha as an expert witness. Okorocha testified that there were compounds in the blood sample that wouldn't have been there without fermentation, specifically acetone and isopropyl alcohol. According to Okorocha, fermentation could drastically increase alcohol levels in blood or even create alcohol readings where there was no alcohol consumed. Kolovos argued that the blood sample had been improperly handled. He pointed out that the officer responsible for adding the preservative to the blood admitted during testimony that he'd failed to shake the sample, a step supposedly necessary to prevent fermentation. The defense's argument was clear. What if Chidester's true BAC was actually 0.02 and the fermentation inflated it to 0.18? But prosecutors were ready for this challenge. They called Michigan State Police forensic scientist Tabitha Faust as their rebuttal expert witness. Faust was the scientist who'd actually tested Chidester's blood at the state lab. She testified that the amount of isopropyl found was completely insignificant and the amount of acetone was so small it wasn't even reportable. She explained that acetone can occur naturally in people's bodies if they have diabetes, follow a ketogenic diet, experience high stress, are pregnant, or have had a binge drinking episode. Faust stated clearly, there was no evidence of fermentation in her analysis of Chidester's blood sample. The 0.18 reading was accurate. The blood had been handled correctly. The defense's fermentation theory simply didn't hold up under scrutiny. Beyond the alcohol, there was also the question of medication. Forensic scientist Paige Beauchamp testified that gabapentin, a seizure and pain medication that acts as a central nervous system depressant, was found in Chidester's blood. According to Beauchamp, mixing alcohol and gabapentin could exacerbate the effects of both substances. So even if we accepted that Chidester was on legitimate medication for a medical condition, she'd combined that medication with significant alcohol consumption, a dangerous cocktail that would have severely impaired her ability to drive safely. Kolovos maintained throughout the trial that Chidester suffered from epileptic-type seizures in her legs that caused sporadic paralysis. He said she'd been hospitalized the previous fall after blacking out and had been barred by her doctor from driving for 6 months after being put on medication in November. If that timeline was accurate, she shouldn't have been driving until the end of March 2024, and the crash happened April 20th, barely 3 weeks after she would have been cleared to drive again. But here's the problem with the seizure defense. No medical experts testified about Chidester's actual history of seizures. Kolovos talked about it in his arguments, but no neurologist took the stand to say, yes, this patient has a documented history of seizures that cause her legs to flatten involuntarily. Prosecutors pointed this out repeatedly. There was no evidence presented that Chidester had a seizure on April 20th. What there was evidence of, mountains of evidence, was sustained alcohol consumption followed by reckless driving. Monroe County Assistant Prosecutor Ken Lorine summed it up perfectly during closing arguments. She drove her car into an occupied building knowing she was unfit to operate a vehicle. The key word there is knowing. After she'd already crashed into her neighbor's truck and a tree while backing out of her driveway, Chidester had clear, undeniable evidence that she was not fit to drive. But she didn't stop. She didn't go back inside. She didn't call for help. Instead, she put her car in drive and accelerated toward a building where children were celebrating a birthday. That's what the investigation revealed. Not a tragic medical emergency, not an unfortunate accident caused by an unforeseeable seizure, but a series of deliberate choices: buying wine at 9 a.m., drinking throughout the morning, getting behind the wheel despite being severely impaired, ignoring the warning of the first crash, and then accelerating with her foot pressed to the floor until she destroyed lives. The physical evidence, the surveillance footage, the blood test results, the event data recorder data, the witness testimony, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. Marshella Chidester was drunk, she knew she was drunk, and she drove anyway, and 2 children paid for that decision with their lives. The trial of Marshella Chidester began on the 3rd of March 2025 in Monroe County Circuit Court, presided over by Judge Daniel White. Nearly a year after the crash that killed Alanah and Zayn Phillips, their family would finally get their day in court. And what would unfold over 4 days would be one of the most emotional trials Monroe County had ever witnessed. Chidester faced 9 criminal charges: 2 counts of second-degree murder for the deaths of Alanah and Zayn Phillips, 2 counts of operating under the influence of alcohol causing death, and 5 counts of operating under the influence of alcohol causing serious injury. If convicted on the murder charges alone, she was essentially facing life in prison. Her defense attorney, Bill Kolovos, had a daunting task ahead of him. He maintained throughout that this wasn't a case of drunk driving, it was a tragic medical emergency. According to Kolovos, Chidester suffered from epileptic-type seizures in her legs that caused sporadic paralysis. When she had these seizures, he claimed her feet would flatten involuntarily. That's what happened on April 20th, he argued. Not intoxication. Not recklessness. A seizure. In his opening statement, Kolovos told the jury that Chidester had only consumed 1 glass of wine that day at Verner's Tavern, and she didn't finish it. He also attacked the blood alcohol results, claiming the blood sample hadn't been properly handled or stored, leading to fermentation that artificially inflated her BAC from what might have been 0.01 or 0.02 to the reported 0.18. Now you've got something that's fermenting, Kolovos told the jury. So you could have something that's 0.01 or 0.02 that turns into a 2.0 because it's fermented. The prosecution, led by Assistant Prosecutor Kenneth Lorraine, had a completely different story to tell. In their opening statement, they laid out a timeline of deliberate choices. Chidester wasn't a victim of a medical emergency. She was drunk, she knew she was drunk, and she drove anyway. And when she crashed into her neighbor's truck and tree before even leaving her property, she had clear warning that she shouldn't be behind the wheel. But she kept going. The defendant backed out of her driveway, accelerating her car, crashing into a small tree and then into her neighbor's full-size pickup truck, forcing it through a working fence, prosecutors told the jury. The defendant then places her car into drive and speeds off. That decision, they argued, showed intent, not necessarily intent to kill, but intent to operate a vehicle while knowing she was unfit to drive. Now, over the course of 4 days, both sides would call witnesses to make their case. And it would become one of the most gut-wrenching trials anyone in that courtroom had ever experienced. The prosecution moved quickly on the first day, calling 8 witnesses faster than anyone expected. The courtroom was packed with family members, survivors, and community members who wanted to see justice for Alanah and Zayn. Kristen Sigler took the stand first. She was the mother who'd rented the Swan Boat Club for her 3-year-old son's birthday party that day. She testified that she'd stepped outside to FaceTime a friend when she heard an explosion, something that sounded like a bomb going off. When she ran back inside, chaos had erupted. Tables were overturned. Dust was everywhere. People were screaming. Sigler described the horrifying moment she realized a child was pinned under Chidester's vehicle. She pulled 4-year-old Zayn Phillips out from under the car. I said, "Do you know who you are?" Sigler testified through tears. He said, "Yes, Zayn." I said, "Do you know who I am?" He said, "Yes, God, Mama." Those would be among the last words Zayn would ever speak. Sigler also testified that 8-year-old Alanah Phillips's body was pinned against a doorframe by Chidester's vehicle. The image was devastating. And then Sigler testified about something else. When she grabbed Chidester amid the chaos, she smelled alcohol on her breath. Not faint traces. The smell of alcohol was obvious. William Schmidt, a neighbor who witnessed the aftermath, brought video evidence showing what he described as a war zone. Cell phone footage captured the screams, the dust, the devastation. You could hear a woman screaming, "Who is it? Who is under the car?" The raw terror in those voices was unbearable to listen to. Jason Johnson, another witness, also brought video from the scene. In it, you can see the extent of the destruction. Chidester's SUV had traveled approximately 25 feet inside the building. Tables were crushed. People were lying on the ground, injured. And amid all of this, Chidester kept repeating the same phrases, "What happened?" and "I passed out." But multiple witnesses testified that Chidester appeared drunk. She smelled like alcohol. Her eyes were bloodshot and watery. She was unsteady on her feet. This wasn't someone who just had a medical emergency. This was someone who was severely intoxicated. Then came the body camera footage. Deputy Stephen Schmidt's body-worn camera captured his interaction with Chidester at the scene. He could smell intoxicants on her. He conducted a field sobriety test, and while she recited the alphabet correctly, she couldn't focus her eyes on his finger. When Schmidt asked her to rate how drunk she felt on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being passed out drunk, Chidester answered 7. 7. Think about that. She admitted she was severely impaired. Schmidt asked her directly, "Should you have been driving?" Her response was chilling. "I wouldn't want to drive," she told him. She knew. She knew she was too drunk to drive, and she got behind the wheel anyway. As the day progressed, the courtroom was overcome with emotion. Some people sobbed as video evidence was played. One crash victim needed to be consoled in the hallway after testifying, reliving the trauma all over again. This wasn't just a trial, it was a collective re-experiencing of a community's worst day. If the first day was emotional, the second day was absolutely devastating. Because on March 4th, Mariah Dodds took the stand. Mariah Dodds was the mother of Alanah, Zayn, and their older brother Jaden. She'd brought all 3 of her children to the birthday party that day, and when Chidester's SUV crashed through the wall, Dodds's entire world ended. Dodds testified that her last memory at the party was giving her children cake pops at a table inside the Swan Boat Club. Then everything went black. She woke up in the hospital the day after the crash with her sister crying beside her bed. Dodds asked why they were there. That's when her sister told her that their eldest son, Jaden, had been life-flighted to another hospital with serious injuries. And then came the words no parent should ever hear. Zayn and Alanah were no longer there. Imagine waking up from unconsciousness and learning that 2 of your 3 children are dead. Dodds broke down on the stand, crying as she recounted the nightmare of that moment. The courtroom was silent except for her sobs. Even Judge White appeared visibly moved. When prosecutors finished questioning Dodds, it was time for the defense's cross-examination. Bill Kolovos approached the witness stand, but then something extraordinary happened. He stood there in silence for a few moments, his face turned away from the cameras, but those in the courtroom could see he was crying. "I'm sorry for your loss," Kolovos said softly, his voice shaking. He began to explain that he'd recently lost his own son. "He died peacefully," Kolovos continued, struggling to get the words out. "Every time I work on your case, I think of your children. You have my deepest sympathy." Tears streamed down his face as he stood before Dodds. "I'm human," he said. "I'm the defense attorney, but I'm human. You seem like a much stronger person than me." He told Dodds he had no questions for her. "You're already going through enough in life," he said. "My prayers are with you and your family." It was an unprecedented moment. Defense attorneys don't usually break down crying in front of the jury while declining to cross-examine a key witness. But Kolovos's grief was genuine. He'd lost his own child, and seeing Dodds's pain was too much. Even Chidester was crying at the defense table. The emotional weight in that courtroom was almost unbearable. Also testifying on day 2 was Edward Smothers, just 14 years old. He'd gone to the birthday party with his aunt Mariah Dodds and his cousins Alanah and Zayn. He testified about hearing the crash and somewhat remembering it happening. He couldn't walk afterward. He didn't even try to stand because it hurt too much. Watching a teenager describe being injured at what should have been a joyful celebration was heartbreaking. Multiple law enforcement officers also testified on day 2, including the officers who responded to the scene and the deputy who was present when Chidester's blood was drawn at Monroe Hospital. The prosecution was methodically building its case blood draw procedure, field sobriety tests, witness observations, all pointing to severe intoxication. On Thursday, March 6th, the defense called its final witness, Okorie Okorocha, a forensic toxicologist. Okorocha testified that there were compounds in Chidester's blood sample that wouldn't have been there without fermentation, specifically acetone and isopropyl alcohol. According to Okorocha, fermentation could drastically increase alcohol levels in blood or even create alcohol readings where there was no alcohol consumed. It was the defense's last-ditch effort to discredit the BAC results. But then the prosecution called its rebuttal witnesses. They brought back Michigan State Police forensic scientist Tabitha Faust, who'd actually tested Chidester's blood at the state lab. Faust testified that the amount of isopropyl found was completely insignificant, and the amount of acetone was so small it wasn't even reportable. She explained that acetone can occur naturally in people's bodies under various conditions. There was no evidence of fermentation in her analysis. The 0.18 reading was accurate. The prosecution also called one more witness, Anthony Cathawa, the party store employee who'd sold Chidester 4 small bottles of white wine and a standard bottle of red Cabernet at 9:01 a.m. on April 20th. His testimony, combined with the home surveillance footage, completely demolished the defense's claim that Chidester had only consumed 1 glass of wine at lunch. Finally, Deputy Alec Predmore testified about what was found when Chidester's vehicle was removed from the Swan Boat Club. In the center console, investigators discovered a small bottle of Chardonnay, one of those mini bottles. Even in her car, ready to go, there was more alcohol. With all witnesses heard, it was time for closing arguments. Prosecutor Kenneth Loran stood before the jury and methodically walked through the evidence. He emphasized that this wasn't a typical drunk driving crash. Chidester had crashed into her neighbor's truck and a tree before even leaving her property. She had to know that things were not right, Lorraine said. But she continued on. She continued on at full speed. He replayed footage of her vehicle crashing into the building at 44 miles per hour with the accelerator at 96%. Look at those to determine her intent, he told the jury. Lorraine argued that Chidester's willful operation of her vehicle showed intent. She knew she was impaired. She knew something was wrong after the first crash, but she kept going. It's about justice for these two kids, Lorraine said, showing images of Alanah and Zayn Phillips to the jury. Bill Kolovos gave his closing argument next. He maintained there was no intent to kill anybody that day. He questioned why the prosecution hadn't brought the surveillance footage of Chidester drinking in her kitchen earlier in the trial, suggesting they were hiding it or manipulating the timeline. He emphasized Chidester's clean record. She doesn't go around committing crimes, Kolovos said. He implored the jury to consider that this was a medical emergency, not a criminal act. Your decision is going to affect my client's life, he concluded, thanking the jury for their work. Judge White gave the jury their instructions, and at approximately 1:30 p.m., they began deliberations. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Think about that after 4 days of testimony, 27 prosecution witnesses, multiple defense witnesses, and mountains of evidence. It took them less than 2 hours to reach a decision. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Marshella Chidester sat at the defense table, her face unreadable. Brian Phillips, the father of Alanah and Zayn, sat in the gallery wearing a shirt that said, "Those we love don't go away. They walk beside us every day," with photos of his children on it. The verdict was read. Guilty. On all 9 counts. 2 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of operating under the influence of alcohol causing death, 5 counts of operating under the influence of alcohol causing serious injury. Guilty on every single charge. Brian Phillips broke down crying. After nearly a year of waiting, after living with the unbearable grief of losing his children, justice had finally been served. Outside the courthouse, he told reporters, "I feel like the jury got this one right on all counts. I believe that she deserves to be where she's at. My babies can finally rest peacefully. This is what we've been waiting for." Monroe County Prosecutor Jeff Yorkey held a press conference after the verdict. "We appreciate everything the jury did here today," Yorkey said. "We think they did a phenomenal job in evaluating the evidence." Chidester's attorney, Bill Kolovos, spoke briefly to the press as well. He said his client was devastated and would appeal the verdict. But for the families of Alanah and Zayn Phillips, for the survivors who would carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives, the verdict was the first step toward closure. The trial was over. Marshella Chidester had been found guilty. Now all that remained was sentencing. Wednesday afternoon, Kolovos began calling his witnesses. First up was Lieutenant Brian Quinn from the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, the same officer who testified for the prosecution about the event data recorder findings. Kolovos asked Quinn multiple times if he'd ever seen someone having a medical issue who put both feet on the brake and pedal at the same time. Quinn said he'd investigated many crashes involving medical issues, but he wasn't qualified to say what may have caused both feet to go to the pedals. It was a crucial admission the defense couldn't get an expert to confirm their seizure theory. Next came Kelly Thornton, who worked part-time at Verner's Tavern. She testified that Chidester arrived around 11 a.m. Numberlands on April 20th with 2 friends and stayed about an hour, cashing out at 12:15 p.m. Thornton told jurors Chidester had a glass of wine, a water, and a cup of white chicken chili. When asked if Chidester finished the wine, Thornton answered, "I don't recall." She also testified that Chidester did not appear intoxicated when she served her, and she didn't see Chidester leave. This was the defense's best evidence: 1 glass of wine at lunch, and the bartender said Chidester didn't appear drunk. But the problem was, this testimony didn't account for the hours of drinking captured on Chidester's own home surveillance cameras that morning. After the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 9 counts in March 2025, everyone knew the sentencing hearing would be emotional. But nobody was prepared for just how devastating it would be. The sentencing was scheduled for Thursday, the 15th of May 2025, more than a year after the crash that killed Alanah and Zayn Phillips. Monroe County Circuit Court Judge Daniel White would preside over what he would later call the most tragic, the most heartbreaking case this courtroom has ever seen. Between the guilty verdict in March and the sentencing in May, something significant happened. Marshella Chidester fired her trial attorney, Bill Colivus, the same attorney who'd broken down crying during Mariah Dodds's testimony. In his place, she hired James Amberg to represent her at sentencing. It was a strategic move, likely hoping a fresh voice might persuade the judge toward leniency. The courtroom was packed that Thursday afternoon. Family members of the victims filled the gallery. Survivors of the crash attended. Media cameras lined the back of the room. And sitting at the defense table, wearing what appeared to be street clothes rather than jail attire, was 6-7-year-old Marshella Chidester. She would remain largely expressionless through much of the hearing until the victim impact statements began. Zayn Phillips, the father of Alanah and Zayn, was the first to address the court. He walked to the podium wearing a black t-shirt that said, "Those we love don't go away. They walk beside us every day," with photos of his children printed on it. His voice shook as he began to speak, tears already streaming down his face. He told the court about the day of the crash, about dropping his kids off at the birthday party, excited and happy, about how, an hour later, he started getting phone calls from people he hadn't seen or talked to in years. "I could feel in my stomach that something was wrong," Phillips said. He described arriving at the Swan Boat Club and being met with absolute chaos, emergency vehicles everywhere, people screaming, the building torn apart. And then came the moment that would haunt him forever. Before anyone officially told him the news, Zayn Phillips knew. He dropped to the floor and begged police not to say that his children were dead, but they were. Alanah had just turned 8 years old. Zayn was about to turn 5. Instead of celebrating, Phillips said through sobs, "We buried them." He looked directly at Chidester as he spoke. Her eyes met his, only sometimes looking away. "What you took from me, I will never, ever get back," Phillips told her. "My daughter was trying to be just like me, playing basketball. She just celebrated her 8th birthday. Zayn was about to be 5. Phillips's voice cracked with emotion. "It's hard even to wake up knowing that they're not here. It's hard that their older brother had to be without his brother and sister. And I hope every day that you realize what you took from us." He paused, wiping tears from his eyes. "You don't have no kids, so you don't know what it feels like." Then Phillips said something that captured the unbearable reality of his loss. "I don't wish nothing but the worst for you, and I hope you feel what we feel every day." The pain in his voice was palpable. This wasn't about revenge, this was a father trying to convey the magnitude of a loss that words could never fully express. Chidester cried during Phillips's statement, tears running down her face. But whether those were tears of genuine remorse or self-pity would become a point of contention. Finally, it was time for Judge Daniel White to hand down the sentence. He took a moment before speaking, looking at the courtroom, at the families, at Chidester. Then he began. "This case might be the most tragic, the most heartbreaking case this courtroom has ever seen," White said. "This crime destroyed lives. It destroyed families, and it changed so many people in a negative way." Judge White made it clear he believed the jury reached the right verdict. "I believe the jury got it right," he said. The evidence of this defendant's guilt was overwhelming. He recounted the facts of the case: the wine purchases at 9 a.m., the surveillance footage showing hours of drinking, the blood alcohol content of 0.18, the crash into the neighbor's truck, the decision to keep driving, the event data recorder showing 96% on the accelerator with no braking. "This wasn't just an accident," Judge White said, his voice firm. "It was a crime." Then came the sentence. For the 2 counts of second-degree murder, Marshella Chidester was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison. She would also serve 84 to 180 months for 2 counts of operating a vehicle while intoxicated causing death, and 20 to 24 months for 5 counts of operating a vehicle while intoxicated causing injury. All sentences would run concurrently, meaning she'd serve them at the same time rather than one after another. At 67 years old, a 25 to 50-year sentence was effectively a life sentence. Even if Chidester serves the minimum 25 years, she'll be 92 years old when she's eligible for parole. If she serves the maximum 50 years, she'll be 117 years old, an impossibility. As her attorney said, she'll likely die in prison. Judge White concluded by saying, "What happened on the 20th of April 2024 can never be undone. 2 innocent children are gone. Families are forever changed, and nothing this court does today will bring Alanah and Zayn back. But justice has been served. After the sentencing, as deputies led Marshella Chidester out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Zayn Phillips broke down crying. It was over. After more than a year of waiting. After the investigation, the trial, the guilty verdict, and now the sentencing, it was finally over. Outside the courthouse, Phillips spoke to reporters. "I feel like the jury got this one right on all counts," he said, still emotional. "I believe that she deserves to be where she's at. My babies can finally rest peacefully. This is what we've been waiting for." Phillips said he was heading to the cemetery to visit his children's graves. "I need to let them know how today went," he said. "I need to tell them, babies, we did it." Monroe County Prosecutor Jeff Yorkey also addressed the media. "We appreciate everything the jury did here today," Yorkey said. "We think they did a phenomenal job in evaluating the evidence. This was a case where the evidence was overwhelming and justice was served."
Ryan, I've been thinking about what I was going to say to you for over a year. It was a terrible, terrible tragedy. I can't help it. Say I'm so very, very sorry for the loss of your children. I pray for them every day. And I ask that their Father would also forgive me, as well as people that were injured. I never meant to harm those children or anyone that was involved in the accident. And the only thing that I can say is, I'm so very sorry. And I never, ever meant to come across as not being sorrowful. I've asked the Lord to forgive me. And I ask that you at least look into your heart, and at some point, if you can possibly forgive me, I would appreciate that so much. I have a little verse that I want to read. It said, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercy never ends." And that comes from Lamentations 3:22. And I hope the Lord will show you some mercy and help you to get over your terrible tragedy, your loss of your children. And I'm, again, so very sorry. And I pray every day for you and your family, as well as I do for the other people that were injured. I pray that they would be able to recover and get back to their normal selves again. I'm sorry. That's really all I can say.
All right, thank you.
So where does this leave us? Marshella Chidester is currently incarcerated in the Michigan Department of Corrections, serving her 25 to 50-year sentence. At 67 years old, this is effectively a life sentence. Even if she's released at the minimum 25 years, she'll be 92. The reality is, she'll likely die in prison. Her attorney has indicated plans to appeal the conviction, claiming errors during the trial. But given the overwhelming evidence, the surveillance footage showing her drinking all morning, the blood alcohol content of 0.18, the event data recorder proving she had her foot 96% on the accelerator with zero braking, the witness testimony, the crash into her neighbor's truck before she even left her property, an appeal faces an almost impossible uphill battle. But this case isn't just about one woman's choices and the consequences she now faces. It's about the ripple effects that continue to devastate an entire community. The impact on Monroe County. Newport, Michigan, is a small, tight-knit community. Steve Cybula, a local who lives down the street from the Swan Boat Club, said he knew something terrible had happened when he saw a medical helicopter flying into his neighborhood. He has a 5-year-old daughter similar in age to Zayn Phillips. "I can't imagine the pain and loss," he told reporters days after the crash. The tragedy brought the community together, but it also shattered their sense of safety. Dozens gathered for a candlelight vigil just days after the crash. They stood in the parking lot of the Swan Boat Club, the same lot where Chidester's vehicle had torn through the building, holding candles, praying, reading scriptures. Family members attended, including Michael Hatfield, the sibling's uncle, who said, "It's hard to really put in perspective how to feel. Right now, it's an empty feeling." The makeshift memorial outside the boat club grew by the hour. Teddy bears, flowers, crosses, balloons, people came from all over Monroe County to leave tributes to Alanah and Zayn. The Swan Boat Club itself posted on Facebook, "We have no profound words that can heal us after the unimaginable tragedy. Only feelings, sadness, shock, frustration. We are a fellowship of people who band together when tragedy strikes." The Flat Rock Community Schools, where Alanah and Zayn attended, sent counselors and social workers to help students process the loss. Superintendent Andrew Brody wrote to families, "Our entire school community is reeling from this devastating news, and our hearts ache for the families and loved ones of those affected by this unimaginable tragedy." Think about that for a second. An entire school district mourning two children who should have been celebrating a birthday party, not planning funerals. The survivors still living with the consequences, but this story doesn't end with Chidester's prison sentence. The survivors are still dealing with the physical and emotional scars more than a year later. The bigger picture: drunk driving in America. Now, let's zoom out for a moment. According to Mothers Against Drunk Driving, approximately 13,000 people are killed every year by impaired drivers in the United States. That's 13,000 families destroyed, 13,000 funerals, 13,000 lives cut short, all 100% preventable. Nearly 400,000 people are injured annually by drunk drivers. Think about the medical bills, the lost wages, the physical therapy, the emotional trauma. The cost, both human and financial, is staggering. MAD released a statement after Chidester's crash. "No one's life should ever be cut short by anyone who chooses to drive impaired. Victims and families deserve for every drunk driving offense to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law as a violent crime." And that's the key word: choice. Marshella Chidester made a series of choices on the 20th of April 2024. She chose to buy wine at 9 a.m. She chose to drink throughout the morning. She chose to get behind the wheel. She chose to keep driving after crashing into her neighbor's truck. Every single one of those was a choice. Why this story matters. So, why did I cover this case? Why spend this much time going through every detail of Marshella Chidester's choices and their consequences? Because drunk driving is still happening every single day. Because people still think, "I'm fine to drive after drinking." Because someone, somewhere, right now, is making the same choices Chidester made, and tomorrow, another family might be destroyed. If this video makes even one person think twice before getting behind the wheel after drinking, then it's worth it. If it makes one person call an Uber instead of driving home from the bar, then Alanah and Zayn's story wasn't told in vain. The prosecution said it best during closing arguments. She drove her car into an occupied building knowing she was unfit to operate a vehicle. That single sentence captures everything wrong with drunk driving. People know they're impaired. They know they shouldn't drive. And they do it anyway. What can we learn? Here's what we can take away from this tragedy. First, if you drink, don't drive. Period. Call a rideshare, call a friend, call a taxi, sleep it off. There is no excuse, none, for getting behind the wheel while intoxicated. Second, if you see someone about to drive drunk, intervene. Take their keys, offer them a ride, call them a cab. Don't let them make a choice they can't take back. Third, hold drunk drivers accountable. The jury in this case deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Chidester guilty on all counts. They saw the evidence, they heard the testimony, and they made the right call. That's what justice looks like. And finally, remember the victims. Alanah Phillips, 8 years old, who was trying to be just like her dad, playing basketball. Zayn Phillips, 4 years old, who was about to turn 5. These weren't just names in a news story. They were children with futures, with dreams, with families who loved them. So, what do you think about this case? Do you believe the 25 to 50-year sentence was justice? Or should Chidester have received life without parole? Do you think establishments like Verner's Tavern should be held accountable when they serve alcohol to visibly intoxicated people? And how do we, as a society, finally stop drunk driving from destroying more families? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this case affected you, if you learned something new, or if you think more people need to hear this story, please hit that like button. It helps this video reach more people and spreads awareness about the devastating consequences of drunk driving. And if you're new here, welcome. This channel covers true crime cases with depth, respect, and accuracy. We don't sensationalize tragedy, we tell the stories that need to be told. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case. Thank you for watching. Remember Alanah and Zayn Phillips, remember their family, and please, if you've been drinking, don't drive. Until next time, stay safe.